December 14th, 1941, 02:45 hours. Luftwaffe Airfield, Sirte, Libya. Hauptmann Franz Bauer had walked the perimeter twice that night, checking sentries who were bored and cold despite the desert location. The airfield held 37 aircraft, Messerschmitt fighters and Junkers transports that represented substantial German investment in North African air superiority. Security was adequate by desert standards. Guard posts at reasonable intervals, machine gun positions covering approaches, regular patrols. Bauer had commanded airfield security for 8 months without incident. The front line was 80 miles away. The British were retreating. This was safe territory. At 2:47 hours, headlights appeared on the southern perimeter road. Bauer assumed a supply convoy had arrived early. Logistics were chaotic in North Africa, and schedules meant little. Then the vehicles accelerated, crashed through the perimeter fence, and began firing. What happened next lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though Bauer would remember it as simultaneously eternal and instantaneous. The vehicles, he counted 8, maybe 10, were modified jeeps mounting heavy machine guns that fired continuously as they drove between parked aircraft. Tracer rounds ignited fuel tanks. Explosions rippled across the airfield. Men were shooting, screaming, running. Bauer tried to organize response, but the raiders were already leaving, driving back through the fence they'd destroyed, disappearing into darkness before German forces could react coherently. When dawn revealed the damage, Bauer stood among burning aircraft wrecks and tried to understand what had occurred. The attack had been perfectly executed, maximum destruction achieved in minimum time by a force that appeared, killed, and vanished. His security arrangements, adequate against conventional assault, had been completely ineffective against an enemy that didn't follow normal tactical patterns. The British, he would learn, called this unit the Special Air Service. The Germans would come to call them something else, Wüstengeister, desert ghosts. And over the next 3 years, that name would spread from North Africa to France to Germany itself, carried by German soldiers who'd encountered an enemy that seemed to operate outside normal military rules and induced fear disproportionate to their actual numbers. Bauer survived the war and was interviewed in 1967 about his North African service. When asked about the airfield raid, his response was immediate and emphatic. The regular British Army we could fight. We understood their tactics, their limitations. The SAS were different. They attacked when and where we felt safe. They moved through terrain we thought impassable. They destroyed more with 20 men than entire battalions could achieve through conventional assault. We feared them because we couldn't predict them, couldn't stop them, and couldn't retaliate. They made us afraid in our own rear areas, which is the worst kind of military fear. The impossible beginning. The Special Air Service began in 1941 as an idea that most British military establishment considered somewhere between dubious and ridiculous. Lieutenant David Stirling, recovering from a parachute training accident, had conceived a fundamentally different approach to fighting in North Africa. Small teams of highly trained soldiers operating far behind German lines, attacking vulnerable targets like airfields and supply dumps, creating damage and disruption disproportionate to force size. The conventional military wisdom held that such operations were suicidal fantasies. Small units operating without support in hostile territory would be quickly detected, surrounded, and destroyed. The desert was vast, but not empty. German and Italian forces controlled most of it, and isolated British teams would have no reinforcement, no artillery support, no means of escape if compromised. Stirling's proposal seemed to ignore basic military realities about force protection and sustainable operations. Sterling persisted with characteristic stubbornness, eventually gaining permission to recruit and train a small unit for experimental operations. The men he selected were misfits by conventional military standards, soldiers who'd been disciplined for insubordination, who couldn't follow standard procedures, who possessed skills and temperaments unsuited for normal units. One recruit had been arrested for assaulting a superior officer. Another had gone absent without leave repeatedly. Several were commandos whose previous units had found them too difficult to manage. These were precisely the men Sterling wanted. Individuals capable of thinking independently, surviving in hostile conditions, and operating without supervision. The SAS wouldn't succeed through discipline and conformity. It would succeed through initiative and improvisation. Sterling needed soldiers who could make decisions under pressure, adapt to changing circumstances, and complete missions without detailed orders or constant oversight. The training was brutal and unconventional. Navigation across featureless desert, demolition of aircraft and vehicles using minimal explosives, marksmanship under stress, long-distance movement on foot carrying heavy loads, survival with limited water and supplies. The men learned to operate in pairs or small groups, with each soldier capable of performing multiple roles. If the team leader was killed, anyone else could take command. If the explosives expert was wounded, someone else could complete the demolition. Redundancy and cross-training ensured mission capability despite casualties. The first operation was planned for November 1941, a parachute insertion to attack German airfields before a major British offensive. The mission was disaster from the beginning. High winds scattered the paratroopers across the desert. Several men were injured during landing. Equipment was lost. The scattered teams couldn't reach their targets. The survivors struggled back to British lines, having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that parachute insertion in desert conditions was impractical with available technology. Conventional commanders saw the failure as proof that Sterling's concept was fundamentally flawed. Sterling saw it as proof that insertion method needed changing while the basic concept remained sound. If parachutes didn't work, they'd use ground vehicles instead. The long-range desert group, experienced desert navigators, could transport SAS teams to target areas, wait while they conducted raids, then extract them afterward. This approach eliminated parachute vulnerabilities while preserving operational surprise. The raids that changed everything. The revised operational method proved devastatingly effective. On December 14, 1941, SAS teams conducted simultaneous raids on multiple German airfields, destroying aircraft with explosive charges placed directly on parked planes. The attack succeeded because German security assumed that British forces were far away and couldn't reach rear area installations without being detected. The SAS approach, moving through supposedly impassable desert to attack targets from unexpected directions, bypassed German defensive assumptions completely. The psychological impact exceeded physical damage. German commanders had organized defenses against conventional British armor and infantry attacks. They hadn't anticipated small British teams appearing deep in German-controlled territory, destroying valuable aircraft and vanishing before response forces could engage them. The raids demonstrated that German rear areas weren't safe, that valuable assets could be destroyed by forces too small and mobile to intercept, and that the desert's vastness protected attackers as much as defenders. Subsequent raids refined the technique. Teams learned optimal target selection, prioritizing aircraft and fuel dumps that represented high value relative to defensive strength. They developed better demolition methods using Lewis bombs, small explosive charges that could be attached to aircraft fuel tanks and detonated by time fuses. They improved navigation, learning to move accurately across featureless terrain using sun compasses and dead reckoning. They mastered the critical skill of vanishing after attacks, using multiple escape routes and rapid movement to evade German response forces. The raid's tempo increased through early 1942. German airfields across Libya experienced regular attacks that destroyed aircraft, killed personnel, and forced defensive reallocation. Luftwaffe commanders had to divert resources from frontline operations to rear area security. Guard forces were increased, patrols were expanded, defensive positions were strengthened. All these measures reduced German combat effectiveness at the front, while trying to stop an enemy that numbered perhaps 60 men operating in teams of 4 to 12. The mathematics were compelling. A single SAS team of 4 men operating for one night could destroy more aircraft than an entire squadron of RAF bombers might achieve through conventional raids, while suffering far lower casualties and using minimal resources. The cost-benefit ratio was extraordinary. A handful of soldiers inflicting damage that required conventional forces hundreds of times larger to achieve. The Jeep transformation. The operational method evolved again in mid-1942 when SAS began using specially modified Jeeps as attack platforms rather than just transportation. The Jeeps were stripped of unnecessary weight, loaded with fuel and ammunition, and mounted with twin Vickers machine guns that could deliver sustained fire while moving. This created a mobile weapons platform capable of driving directly onto targets, engaging with overwhelming firepower, and departing before defenders could organize effective response. The Jeep raids were tactically simple, but psychologically devastating. Teams would approach airfields at night, crash through perimeter defenses at high speed, drive between parked aircraft while firing machine guns and throwing explosive charges, then exit through a different perimeter point before German forces understood what was happening. The entire attack might last 90 seconds from breach to departure, giving defenders almost no time to react. Captain David Sterling personally led one of the most successful Jeep raids in July 1942 against an airfield at Sidi Hanaish. His force consisted of 18 Jeeps, carrying perhaps 40 men. They approached at dusk, timing arrival for moment of maximum confusion between day and night security rotations. The Jeeps entered through 3 different perimeter points simultaneously, creating multiple threats that German defenders couldn't address coherently. What followed was choreographed chaos. Jeeps drove down aircraft rows at full speed, gunners firing continuously while other team members threw Lewis bombs onto parked planes. Fuel tanks exploded, illuminating the airfield and creating additional panic among German defenders who couldn't determine attack size or direction in the confusion. German soldiers returned fire, but couldn't acquire clear targets. The Jeeps moved too fast, and smoke obscured everything. The SAS departed after perhaps 3 minutes of sustained violence, leaving behind 37 destroyed aircraft and an airfield in complete disorder. German casualties were minimal. The SAS targeted aircraft and infrastructure, not personnel, but the psychological impact was profound. The defenders had been completely helpless against an attack they hadn't anticipated and couldn't stop. Oberleutnant Klaus Weber survived the Sidi Hanaish raid and described it in a 1953 interview. "We thought we were under assault by a major force, perhaps battalion strength. The noise, the explosions, the tracers, everything suggested massive attack. Only later did we learn it was perhaps 40 British in Jeeps. That was worse than believing it was a large force. If 40 men could destroy an entire airfield, nowhere was safe." We began to fear small British patrols more than we feared their armor divisions. The German response. German commanders faced impossible tactical problems addressing SAS operations. Conventional defensive measures proved ineffective because the SAS didn't attack conventionally. Increasing perimeter guards helped, but couldn't prevent determined raiders from breaching defenses at unexpected points. Expanding patrol areas diluted force concentration without guaranteeably detecting small, fast-moving teams. Strengthening static defenses made targets harder to destroy but didn't prevent attacks from occurring. The fundamental issue was that German forces were organized and trained for conventional warfare, holding ground, controlling territory, engaging enemy forces in decisive battles. The SAS ignored these normal military patterns. They didn't hold ground. They raided it. They didn't control territory. They moved through it. They didn't seek decisive battles. They avoided them. Every German advantage in numbers, firepower, and organization became irrelevant against an enemy that refused to fight on terms where those advantages mattered. Intelligence gathering proved equally frustrating. The SAS left minimal traces. A destroyed airfield indicated their presence, but provided no information about where they'd come from, where they were going, or when they might strike next. Captured equipment revealed little because SAS teams used standard British vehicles and weapons that could have come from any unit. The few prisoners taken initially were enlisted soldiers who knew only their specific mission, not broader SAS strategy or operational plans. German radio intercepts were useless because SAS teams maintained radio silence during operations. Aerial reconnaissance couldn't spot small vehicles camouflaged in vast desert. Local informants were unreliable because the SAS operated in areas with minimal civilian populations. Traditional intelligence methods that worked against conventional forces provided almost nothing useful against unconventional operators. The German response evolved toward creating rapid reaction forces that could respond to SAS attacks after they occurred, attempting to intercept raiders during their escape. This approach occasionally succeeded. Several SAS teams were caught and destroyed during withdrawal, but couldn't prevent the attacks themselves. The SAS accepted that some raids would end in casualties or capture, calculating that overall operational success justified losses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in North Africa, expressed grudging respect for SAS effectiveness in his memoirs. The British Special Air Service caused us more damage per soldier than any other unit of comparable size. They attacked our weakest points, aircraft and supplies, in rear areas with methods we struggled to counter. Conventional military logic suggested they shouldn't have succeeded. Reality demonstrated otherwise. Hitler's fear becomes policy. The SAS's operational success created strategic problems for German high command. The raids weren't just tactically annoying. They were strategically significant, destroying aircraft and supplies that Germany could barely replace, given North African logistics limitations. More importantly, they demonstrated that British forces could operate effectively despite German territorial control, undermining the narrative that Axis forces dominated North Africa. Hitler's response in October 1942 revealed how seriously German leadership took the SAS threat. The Kommandobefehl, Commando Order, directed that captured Allied commandos and special forces be executed immediately without trial, regardless of whether they were in uniform or surrendering properly. The order explicitly mentioned British raiding forces operating behind German lines and characterized them as terror troops who warranted no protection under laws of war. The order was militarily counterproductive. It eliminated intelligence value from captured prisoners and incentivized Allied commandos to fight to death rather than surrender. But its issuance demonstrated genuine fear at highest German command levels. Nations don't order execution of enemy prisoners who pose minimal threat. The commando order acknowledged that British special forces were inflicting damage disproportionate to their numbers, and that normal military procedures weren't adequately addressing the problem. For SAS soldiers, the order merely confirmed what many already assumed. Capture meant death, whether through immediate execution or concentration camp. This knowledge influenced operational planning, with teams carrying sufficient ammunition to ensure they could fight until killed rather than being taken alive. The psychological impact worked both directions. German forces knew that SAS teams would fight desperately when cornered, making their capture extremely costly even when numerically feasible. Some German commanders ignored the commando order, treating captured SAS as regular prisoners of war. Others implemented it enthusiastically, executing British soldiers whose only crime was fighting effectively. The order's inconsistent enforcement created additional uncertainty. Captured SAS might be treated properly or executed depending on which German unit held them, adding another layer of risk to already dangerous operations. Europe, the fear moves north. When Allied forces invaded France in 1944, the SAS's operational theatre expanded from North African desert to European hedgerows, forests, and towns. The tactics adapted while core principles remained constant. Small teams operating independently, attacking vulnerable targets, creating disruption disproportionate to force size. SAS teams parachuted into France weeks before D-Day, establishing bases in remote areas and coordinating with French resistance. Their missions focused on German logistics, destroying rail lines, ambushing supply convoys, sabotaging fuel dumps, cutting communications. Each successful operation forced Germans to divert forces from fighting Allied invasion to protecting rear area infrastructure. The psychological warfare continued. German garrison troops in occupied France began reporting encounters with small British teams that appeared without warning, attacked with professional precision, and vanished before reinforcements arrived. The reports created paranoia among units responsible for rear area security. Any suspicious activity might be SAS reconnaissance, any quiet night might precede a raid. Lieutenant Hans Krebs commanded a supply depot in Brittany and described the persistent anxiety. "We knew the British Special Forces operated in our area. We didn't know where they were or when they might strike. Every night, guards reported suspicious movements that usually proved to be animals or French civilians. But sometimes those movements were British soldiers preparing attacks. The uncertainty was corrosive. We couldn't relax, couldn't assume any location was secure. The knowledge that small enemy teams moved among us created constant tension that conventional enemy forces didn't produce." The SAS's European operations demonstrated their tactical flexibility. Desert warfare had emphasized vehicle mobility and long-range movement. European operations required different approaches: parachute insertion, coordination with resistance forces, operations in populated areas where civilians might help or betray. The SAS adapted successfully, proving their methods worked across different terrains and operational environments. One operation in August 1944 exemplified this adaptability. An SAS team of 12 men ambushed a German convoy transporting fuel to Normandy front lines. The ambush destroyed 37 vehicles, killed approximately 50 German soldiers, and forced the convoy's survivors to abandon remaining vehicles and flee on foot. 12 British soldiers had eliminated a convoy that might otherwise have fueled German armor for days of combat. German response forces arrived hours later, finding destroyed vehicles and no British presence. The SAS team had withdrawn immediately after the ambush, moving to a pre-planned hide site 10 miles away where they remained concealed while German forces searched fruitlessly for enemies who were no longer in the area. The admission of defeat. By late 1944, German military doctrine included specific warnings about British special forces that revealed how profoundly the SAS had impacted German operational thinking. Training materials advised avoiding engagement with small British patrols unless absolutely necessary, noting that such patrols often consisted of elite troops who would inflict casualties disproportionate to their numbers. Field commanders were instructed to treat any encounter with possible SAS forces as serious threat, requiring overwhelming response. These warnings represented remarkable acknowledgement of British unconventional warfare effectiveness. The German Wehrmacht prided itself on military professionalism and tactical superiority, yet doctrine was specifically warning German soldiers that small British teams were dangerous enough to avoid rather than engage, an implicit admission that conventional German forces couldn't reliably defeat unconventional British operators even when holding numerical advantage. Captured German officers provided additional evidence of SAS psychological impact. During interrogations, many expressed greater concern about British special forces than about American armor or Soviet infantry. The SAS's unpredictability and operational flexibility made them uniquely threatening. You couldn't know where they'd strike, couldn't prevent their attacks through normal defensive measures, and couldn't retaliate effectively because they'd already withdrawn. One captured German battalion commander, interrogated in November 1944, was asked which Allied forces he most feared. His response was immediate: the SAS. With American or British regular forces, I understood the battle. They attacked, we defended, outcomes were determined by numbers and firepower and terrain. With the SAS, there was no battle in conventional sense. They simply appeared, destroyed something valuable, and left before we could respond. That's not warfare as I learned it. That's terrorism in military form. Effective terrorism that we had no adequate countermeasures against.